Okay, now we are into the practice and review, which is the fifth step in instructional design. And practice and review is critical for mastery, and if they're not at mastery, then those skills will not generalize. They will not go to, those skills will not be able to be used in unique settings. Having skills generalized is the goal of education. So when we're talking about practice and review, we want to teach the skills and the concepts in a way that allows for retention. And for that to occur, we have to provide tons of practice in the initial mastery. So in that little DI lesson during that modeling, guided practice, independent practice, there must be tons of practice. And to begin with, efficient practice is going to be very massed. And so you saw the video on massed versus spaced, and they both have important components and detractors. But in mass practice, we're going to do a lot of practice on that individual skill until that skill is mastered, whether it's multiplication facts and converting those to memory, or whether it's a certain step or sequence of steps to be able to solve a certain algorithm. We want to make sure that there's tons and tons and tons of mass practice, almost overlearning. Now, as that is progressing, we do want that kind of planned or systematic review of previously learned materials, and also this new, that it's not just mass then move on, but that we go back and we engage in some sort of systematic review of the previously introduced skills. Those skills have to be viewed systematically over time to ensure retention. So those skills serve as a component skill for more advanced problem types, because math always builds. So practice can never really entirely disappear, okay? Because those skills that they're learning now, which are really difficult for them, are just going to be the pre-skills for the next skill that they are going to learn. And once they get that what they're learning now is going to be used in subsequent learning, then it links that together. So it would seem fit to that those skills should be consistently reviewed systematically, and not just a one-shot deal. Again, is this notion of how best to teach. We go in and we talk about this notion of program implementation. We have those 4 steps that will allow us to address issues of any type of program implementation. First, as always, that initial assessment, and then what is the progress monitoring that we are going to engage in. So then what is going to be our presentation techniques? What are going to be our error correction procedures? And how do we diagnose and remediate error problems? So again, think of it in when we're implementing a program, are there pretests there? And does it have a response to intervention or a multi-tiered support, some sort of formative data progress monitoring unit in place? If not, you got to construct it. You got to develop it using your CBO and your CBA. So what are the presentation techniques? How am I going to correct errors? Because there are going to be errors. A lot of times teachers get an error response from a student and they look like they get bewildered. So if we anticipate there's going to be errors and have a systematic procedure for correcting those, it's important. When we start analyzing students' work, how are we going to look for error analysis, and how are we going to look for different error patterns and come up with some sort of remediation plan? So in our first step here of initial assessment and progress monitoring, let's look. We want to determine how students are, how are they performing, and how are we going to monitor that progress. So those are 2 separate components. What's their instructional level, and what's the formative data that I'm going to use that's going to show that these students are responding to this intervention, my instruction. So in that initial assessment, we're going to develop a pretest based on the skill level and what's going to be taught. We don't need to spend a great deal of additional time for skills students have already mastered. What we're looking at is what are those skills that are necessary. So you remember you reverse engineered this during your planning stage, and you know these are the skills that they need to have. Okay, so now how many of them do they have? Because clearly, if they've got them all, then we move on. But what are the skills and the pre-skills that they're going to need to be able to do this? The pre-test guide, it needs to include problem types in that particular skill area, which are taught in earlier grades. The pre-skills required to solve new problems and examples of new problems. So we're going to look at stuff that they've already learned. Then we're going to go back, and we've already got in our head what our assessment's going to be. So we've got these new problems already in there, and we want to have some of those examples. We're going to use this assessment to kind of chart to see how their growth is and how they are responding to that intervention. Teachers should give lots of time to work independently with students who missed earlier problems. So it's not really a tier 2 intervention. Basically what it is that, look, you're going to have kids that are going to acquire information at different levels. And while we're not really talking about differentiation, we kind of are, is we're going to provide more instruction for those that are struggling at certain parts. And we're going to have planned to accelerate those kids who are already there. So again, the big component here is, how am I going to do this initial assessment? Okay. And then how am I going to monitor progress? How am I going to engage in my CBA? All right. In our curriculum-based measure is really this great way, and you saw in the video, that we can take that formative data and we can put it into a form that shows, okay, this student is responding to our intervention. They are above the aim line. We're feeling pretty comfortable about it. So really, it's just charting and graphing, and it's highly motivating. These procedures are reliable and valid to standardize assessments. And basically what that means is that if they're doing well on the formative assessment, guess what? As long as the content is aligned with the state standards, they're going to do well on the state high-stake assessments, these summative assessments. So we're going to see lots of reliability and validity in our formative assessment if those two things are in place, that your curriculum that you're teaching is aligned with state standards, okay? And that you are administering the assessment with fidelity and not saying, well, that was close enough. Okay, it's either they got it or they didn't. Procedures for administering this don't have to be very complex. They just need to be frequent, because we need to have ongoing data. And so what does that mean daily? Sure, why not? Why not have a probe of 10 problems every day at the end of what you taught? It's going to take them 10 minutes, 5 minutes, 3 minutes, 2 minutes to do that. Lots of people use those as exit tickets. So progress monitoring frequently allows teachers to identify where their instruction's fallen out. If everyone is tanking on this particular concept, then it's a teacher delivery issue, or it's the content, they don't possess the pre-skills, or there's something whole class. But if it's just an individual, then they may need some interventions to be able to take care of that. So you now have, you've watched the video on CBMs, you understand a bit about progress monitoring. It's just incredibly important to understand that in initial assessment, we're seeing, are these kids ready? In progress monitoring is, are they mastering the content? So once we've got our assessments in place, then we are and we've got our content that is explicitly reverse engineered, and we've got our strategies, and we know where the present level of performance is for the kid, and we're feeling pretty good about that. Then we start talking about our presentation techniques. We need to keep them focused on the that they are participating, especially in the oral question and answer exchange. Well-designed mathematics instruction requires teacher-directed. It can't always unfold naturally. It can't always be discovery learning. These concepts are important, and these ways, these constructivist approaches are great for going in there once they have some skills under their belt and they're in application. But well-designed mathematics instruction must have a teacher-directed component. It can't be 90 minutes, but it should be at least 30 minutes. We want to provide attention by having tasks to keep the students actively involved. That does not mean it's a straight-out lecture. There should be core responses, there should be participation, they should be doing some independent and some guided work, but it is teacher-directed. The length of time that the teachers need to allocate for explaining and demonstrating really is contingent on the class's response to the intervention. If they are starting to get this and with a high rate of accuracy, remember between 80 and 95%, then we know it's time to move on. Less time talking and more time for student involvement is really important. Like I said, we don't want it to be a straight out lecture based, but you can get students engaged if you utilize unison response with signals. So signals and cueing allow teachers to know exactly when to respond. When students need to respond. It also gives teachers the opportunity to assess. If everyone's answering on cue and there's no trailing, then that is an indicator that students are mastering. If you see lots of trailing and lots of kids not participating, that's an indicator that they're a bit lost, and you're going to have to work with that. Signals have to be clear and loud. There's a video that's going to show how good signals can be used in a classroom, and I want you to be able to watch that because it really affects the pacing. I can control pacing. I can really influence pacing so easily when I go in and I give good core responses with a good signal. Now, what happens when an error occurs? We jump to conclusions way too quickly, and really our error correction procedures is a lot of times is to tell them the right answer or to say no or to have another student. And while that can happen sometimes, you gotta as a teacher, you need to think, what is the source of this error before you go in and correct it. If it's because they're not paying attention, then there's a strategy that you should use. If it's a lack of content knowledge and they don't understand it, then there's a teaching correction that needs to occur. So is this because they're not paying attention or because they don't know the skill? See what the student was doing at the time of the error. Be careful when responding to errors, because a lot of times students can feel punished for giving the wrong answer, and so they're not going to offer up or participate in class. There's a 3-step procedure that has lots of value, and when a student makes an error, then we want to do that model, test, and delay test. So you want to model the correct response. That answer is 4. You want to reduce by 2 both in the numerator and the denominator. Or you can ask questions to generate a response and test the student by presenting the same task again with no assistance. That model, test, delay test is I'm going to model the skill, or I'm going to ask probing questions. It just depends where they are. Are they just starting to get it? Then I'm probably going to model it. If they've got it, but they just kind of lost it over time, then I'm going to ask some probing questions. And it's important then that I'm going to have them do it independently, and then I can come back later and do a delay test 5 minutes, 10 minutes down the road. So we're going to do this model, test, delay test. Students should also be corrected if they respond late or not at all, because a lot of times, especially if you're utilizing core response, they might steal an answer. And so it's not really their answer. They're just kind of taking an answer from the group. So you want to go through a correction procedure. Again, is this because they're not paying attention, or is this because they're lacking the skills? And it's not a one-size-fits-all thing. And when they do, being able to use this model test, delay test. So model, again, can be, I'm going to show you how to do it, or I'm going to ask you probing questions based upon my assessment of your skill level. And then I'm going to have you do it on your own or test. And then that delayed test, down the road, I'm going to have them do it again. Praise students for performing well and for participating. Okay, so we want two sides here, that they got the answer right and they're performing well, and that they're also participating. These things are incredibly important. Okay, so now we go into, once we have this work, again, as we were doing some in our core response, we do need to have a lot of diagnostics when it comes to math instruction. We want to determine the error. We're going to, are they not lining up? Do they not have a concept of place value? Or is decimal placement a problem for them? Or do they not have distributed property down pat? So we want to determine the cause of the errors, because then that gives us what we need to reteach. So the whole key of this is that we're teaching. We're not reviewing. Teaching is about taking them from a particular level and then providing them with instruction, the explicit instruction that is necessary for them to generalize this into unique settings. Teaching is not just answer question and answers, even though that's a part of it. We need to diagnose before we remediate what caused this problem. Why did they fall out on this concept? Are they making the same mistakes over and over and over again? Easy breezy. Just find out what mistake they're making, and they've missed a step in that explicit structure or procedure that you've taught them, and just reteach that. If they're making little mistakes here and there and there and there, but they're not consistent, it could be an attentive problem. But diagnosis is going to really drive the remediation. And it really isn't the same as error correction. Okay? It's not the same, because you're not just reviewing your teacher. Error correction immediately follows the mistake. And it really kind of requires a minimal diagnosis. Is that kid paying attention, or are they lacking skills? That's really all that you're kind of doing in error correction. Were they not paying attention, or were they do they have a skill deficit? But in bigger projects, diagnosis and remediation is an analysis of their independent work. So in that little DI lesson plan, when they go modeling, guided practice, independent practice, it is that independent practice where they start falling out a little bit. So what we want to do is we want to take a look and see, again, if it's consistent mistakes over a variety of problems. Okay, they're just missing a step. Find out the step and reteach it. If it's haphazard all over the place, it could be an attention problem, or it could be a spacing problem, or it could be a variety of things. Then you're going to sit back and just kind of watch them and see how they're doing with this. The teacher examines missed problems on a worksheet and follows the steps to diagnose. First, you're going to analyze. Okay, you're going to look at that worksheet for errors, and you're going to come up with some hypotheses as to what error that student is consistently making. We also can, at this point, we can interview the student. We're going to reteach. Once we've decided here's the causation, we're going to reteach, not everything, but the component, the steps that they made a mistake. And it can either be on the board, or it can be worksheets. Then we're going to test. We're going to remove our supports, okay, which is us, and we're going to see if that individual can do it on their own. So there are different types of errors that Stein talked a lot. One is a fact error. It's amazing how many kids make mistakes in multi-step problems, or word problems, or higher order thinking problems, because they don't know their basic facts. Because we didn't spend enough time for them to be fluent on their basic facts. And so they're allocating all this time to figure out what 8 times 7 is, whereas if they had it memorized, they could just write it down and spend more time on the actual, thinking about the math problem, as opposed to just trying to allocate a bunch of time to figuring out what this 8 times 7 is. Is it a component skill error, that something that was previously taught, one of the pre-skills that we thought they knew, but somehow it's falling out? Okay, so is it a prerequisite skill error? So is it a fact error? lots and lots of problems are just because they don't know their basic facts? Or is it a component skill error, something that we taught in the past, some strategy, some skill that we thought they had, but they don't? It's going to take reteaching that skill. Or is it the new strategy error? That sequence of steps that you came up with that allows them to solve this long division problem or to solve for X. There's a breakdown in one of those steps. If that's the case, watch them solve a problem. Have those steps right beside you. Check off when they accomplish it, and then identify where they're falling out and then reteach those steps. So again, fact error, easy breezy. Flashcards, here we go. Component skill, reteach, and still not as easy as fact errors, but they had it at one time, but they just kind of lost it. So we're just going to kind of reteach them a little bit. Strategy error takes a little bit more diagnosis and being able to take that strategy, those steps that you develop that they are going to engage in to solve this particular algorithm, and they are going to then come in and you're going to follow them very closely and see where they fall out and then reteach that. Okay. Classroom organization and management, clearly these are things that you hear in behavior management. These are things that you hear, in 202 since you first came in. You got to have an organized classroom. It can't be chaotic. The resources all have to be there within access to the student. But more important than that, although that's the foundation, if you don't have an organized classroom structure and the resources, it's really going to fall apart. The daily lesson plan has to include at least 30 minutes of teacher-directed lesson. But really, it can't be, if you're hitting 90 and you're still doing teacher-directed and they're not in some sort of application, you've lost them. But that 30 minutes doesn't mean straight lecture. I mean, I'd go no more than 5 minutes straight lecture before they're doing something, and even less with younger kids. But that they are engaged, and you can do a quick assessment, and you can see when the kids' eyes are kind of glazing over. Get them in a core response. Get them moving. But you need to direct that lesson for no more than 30 minutes. Again, that does not mean that you're lecturing and they're listening. Okay, you are directing what's going on, whether it's in guided practice, independent practice, something along those lines. The introduction of the new skills to student is done by demonstrating, modeling the skill. Show them how to do it step by step using teacher talk. Okay, first thing I'm going to do is this, and they're watching you. Then you go in and you guide them, doing the exact same examples with the same numbers, and then you guide them through those steps. You start assessing and taking a look, who are those students that are struggling, because you're going to have to do some mini lessons for those guys, especially when the other students move off and go into independent work. Hold off on those kids and do another mini lesson. Teachers then need to do a work check, and they need to correct the errors that they find, not by giving them the right answer, but is this a fact error? Is this a component skill error? Or is this a strategy? Is it a fact because they don't know their multiplication tables? Teach them. Is it a component, some previous strategy that they haven't gotten, or they've gotten but they've lost, and so kind of reteach that, not a huge deal. Or a strategy error, that's where these students, they got parts of this explicit strategy that you're teaching, but they're not putting it all together. So you have to watch them do a problem, have them say, this is what I'm doing, this is what I'm doing. Look at those steps and see if indeed there's an error, and where it breaks down, just reteach those steps. So you've got to check, and it's not just grading. You've got to do an error analysis time and time and time again. I see math teachers go in right, wrong. Kid got an 80, no feedback, no idea what's going on. And it's abysmal. It's abysmal instruction. It is ineffective. When those students are doing independent work, you've got to do a work check. And that involves error analysis. And that error analysis has to include, is this a fact error, component skill error, or a strategy error? All right, Good job, and now you can proceed on with the modeling and the error correction and the queuing videos that follow this. Good luck.